Well, I'm going to try my hand at this YouTube thing again, um, just to share some continual reflections about the coronavirus, this pandemic that we're all living through, and try to bring a spiritual perspective to some of the feelings that we have inside that are somewhat unfamiliar and certainly not always comfortable. I spend a lot of time these days looking out my living room window and going out into my backyard and looking at how nature is just continuing to move on, unaware of what's going on in the world. And that brings me some comfort because it certainly is a testimony to the faithfulness of God and the steadfastness of God through all things, through all challenges. And we are living through something we've never lived through before, most of us, that is. So yeah, it's definitely gives us pause to wonder and to observe and to really reflect and think about God's goodness and God's promises. And I think that God always gives us what writers would call hooks, little phrases, little reminders, things that are easy for us to hold on to and to call back to our memory to remind us of his promises. This morning, as I was looking out my living room picture window, I just, found my eyes looking up. And of course, Psalm 121 came to mind. I will lift up my eyes to the hills, from whence cometh my help. My help is from the Lord my God, who made heaven and earth. And that psalm, I don't know it by heart, but it continues to go on saying that God will not allow our foot to slip or stumble, and that the God who watches over Israel never sleeps or slumbers because he's always watching over his children. And I think that little phrase, I will lift up my eyes to the hills, has always been for me a nice memory hook that brings me back to the importance of looking to God in all things. And there's so many others, other phrases like that God provides for us in the Bible, but also some unique personal situations come to mind where he gives us a little hook to always go back to remind us that he's there to guide us and to help us and to counsel us and to see us through. I remember my first year as a teacher, just really struggling, teaching at a dual language Title I school, 90-some% poverty, families of poverty, and a high percentage of second language learners in Greeley. And some kids were really challenging. And one particular, his name was Joe, just tiny little guy, but so ornery and so mean at times and so hateful at times, and so angry at times. And as a new teacher, I did a lot of praying in those. Teachers always pray. You can't get away from it. You shouldn't get away from it. But I did a lot of praying that first year as a teacher. Like, God, help me. I don't know how to reach these kids, and especially kids like Joe. He always wore his jacket. I remember that about him. And I just got this phrase, God prompted me in my mind, that with a counsel that said, see their faces. I've always held on to that when I'm struggling with kids, some of those more difficult children in classroom situations. If you look and you see their faces, that is like a window into their soul, where you really, as a teacher, need to look intentionally to see what is going on in their lives. There goes my phone. So as I really poured myself into Joe and really tried to build relationship with him and get to know him better, and talked to other people who did know him or taught him, I did find out that Joe was homeless, living in his car with his mom and a little brother, I think. That's why he wore his jacket all day long, every day. Probably was wearing the same clothes underneath. Just a little side to those teachers, kids that always wear their jackets to school and cover themselves in their jackets. There's something going on inside that you need to pour yourself into. Anyway, so that see their faces phrase was one of those phrases that God gave to me to always remind me when I'm struggling with a personality that's difficult, to try to intentionally figure out what's going on behind their face or through their face. In the eyes are the window to the soul. So other phrases that God gives us are just so plentiful. I could go on and on and on. Do not fear is one that has been coming to mind a lot lately, over and over and over again. New Testament and Old Testament, God constantly tells his children, do not fear. I am God. I am in control. I've got you. I've got this. And then that brings me to the final one I'll share today, which is Jesus talking to his disciples right before he was crucified, the night of the Last Supper, when he said, peace I leave with you. And then he went on to say that the peace he gives is not the peace that the world gives. It's not that sense of familiarity or that sense of comfort or that sense of all is well. So, sorry, my phone. This is what happens with live recording. Anyway, the peace that he leaves with us is not like the world gives. And then he goes on to say, let not your heart be troubled, neither let it be afraid. Believe in God and believe in me. I've got this. My peace does not resemble the peace of the world, but my peace is deeper, more transcendent. It transcends through all time and space and all troubles and trials, and yes, even those good times of comfort that we long for in our human nature. So my words to you today is to look for those hooks that God brings, those scriptures that are powerful reminders of his goodness. And may you be blessed, because know that he gives us his peace in all things. Amen.